ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
The perfect target for a serial killer.
They know the route, they know the system.
They know their victims.
I've pushed the curtain back. My God.
What's going on?
Who did this?
A former nurse has been charged with murdering 2 elderly people at a Newcastle nursing home.
I maintain my innocence.
The Invisible Killer, an all-new series by Background Briefing. Hear it now on the ABC Listen app.
For so many experts and politicians, the answer to Australia's housing crisis is simple. Supply, supply, supply. Build our way out of the affordability problem and more people will own the roofs over their heads.
It's all about supply.
Very strong supporter of getting supply, additional supply.
But is this supposed solution the cure it's made out to be? In this series, we've looked at how housing became the great investor dream.
At one point it was over 40. We've really massaged that portfolio now, gotten rid of a couple of the lemons.
We've looked at the lifelong impact of exorbitant housing.
Looking about 3 or 4 months now, yeah. And prices, honestly, you wake up the next day and the prices just keep going up and up.
Interrogated the culprits of this crisis.
I haven't found anybody in 7.5 years shake their fist at me and say, Howard, I'm angry with you for letting the value of my house increase.
And whether it's time for a crash, like in New Zealand.
At one point last year, she needed to find an extra $60,000 or so to pay the mortgage. And at the same time, her house had lost about $350,000 worth of value.
We've explained why being hostage to housing affects us all. I'm Sam Hawley from ABC News Daily. This is Housing Hostages, Episode 5, The Supply Solution. Today, a glimmer of hope will take you to the capital city where apartment prices have flattened over the past 5 years and first home buyers are flooding into the market. Why can't we do that everywhere else? And our business editor, Michael Janda, looks at what really needs to be done on supply and demand to make it just a little bit easier for people to buy or rent a home. Michael, politicians of most stripes are singing from the same song sheet, right? They say to make housing cheaper, we need to build more homes. But is it really as simple as that?
Well, Sam, it depends very much who you ask. Some say supply is the issue, while others say it's more demand. Because today we're talking about solutions, we're going to hear from some of the experts who've thought about this problem a lot, especially on the supply side of things. And one of them's Peter Tulip, who until a few years ago was a senior economist at the Reserve Bank. He's now the chief economist at the Centre for Independent Studies, which is a free market think tank. So we're here and we're about to take a walk through Harold Park, which is a fairly new development. Do you know how long it's been here?
Yeah, 2010. I actually used to live near here.
We recently met up at this fairly new, large apartment development built on what used to be a horse racing track on the very edge of Sydney's CBD.
So when this development was proposed, that we have about, I think it's 1,000 or 2,000 apartments replacing what used to be the old Harold Park Paceway. And the Paceway was no longer appropriate for the location, so they sold it. Mirvac bought it and developed it.
When he lived there, there was a lot of opposition to this development, but now there's a lot of local acceptance about the amenities it's brought.
So just paint a picture for me. What kind of development are we talking about there?
So the developer Mirvac, which is one of the country's biggest developers, says the complex provides jobs, ongoing jobs, for about 500 people who work in what's called the tram sheds, which is an old tram shed that's been turned into a small high-end shopping centre with trendy restaurants and cafes. And there's around 1,250 units scattered across about a dozen 6 or 7 story tall apartment blocks, and they house about 2,500 residents. And to cap it all off, Sam, the Tram Sheds has an extremely popular gelato store.
It's a plus for some and a minus for those of us who are watching our weight.
But I guess it gives people a choice if we have these kind of developments.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems with Sydney real estate is the lack of choice. 77% of the residential land in Sydney is reserved for detached single-family houses. And that suits lots of people, but it's a very expensive way of providing housing when land gets scarce.
So, Michael, though, it might have great ice cream, but does Harold Park have affordable housing?
Oh, God, no.
Right.
No, Sam. Aside from one purpose-built block of 75 units that's run by an affordable housing provider, that aside, otherwise the cheapest 3-bedroom apartment that I've seen advertised for sale there had a price guide of almost $2.3 million.
Oh my gosh.
So more expensive than a lot of the houses that surround it.
And how much do you pay for an ice cream?
It's a lot cheaper than a unit.
Good. As long as people can still afford an ice cream.
Well,
The joy of life.
They may not be able to if they've got the mortgage on the
True.
apartment. But what Peter Tulip says is that if you focus too much on the price of the new developments, you miss the real effect on housing affordability.
By far the biggest effect is the effect of extra supply on existing houses. Like any market, if you increase the supply of a good, the price falls.
Right, so he's saying that these new luxury apartments will make older houses cheaper.
Yes, and there's definitely logical merit in that argument. If you flood any market with supply, with enough supply, it should push prices down. And Peter Tulip, like many others, argues that zoning and planning regulations are the number one culprit for keeping housing prices high.
So how much housing does Peter Tulip think we need to build here in Australia to make a real difference to pricing?
So to achieve a substantial improvement in affordability, Peter thinks we need to build a lot more homes.
Oh, we need to increase the housing stock by maybe about 10-15%. So somewhere between 1 and 2 million homes, over and above what we would be doing ordinarily. So the National Cabinet has a target of 1.2 million homes, but most of that is what we would be building anyway. So only a small fraction of that is additional to normal supply, and that addition will help make housing more affordable.
And how would we even go about doing that?
Well, given that Peter thinks planning restrictions are the problem, he believes reducing them is the key solution, and he's far from alone. The YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard movement, has gained an enormous amount of traction in Australia in recent years. They've been particularly active in Sydney and Melbourne, some of our most expensive cities. They've been campaigning against the NIMBYs.
Yes, and they're the not in my backyard folk.
That's right. So, Sam, NIMBYs are mostly older, established residents. They already own their own homes. They don't want to see apartments springing up next door to them. They're worried about the loss of trees in their neighbourhood, worried about the loss of open space, and worried about increased congestion. Now, all valid concerns, but the YIMBY argument is that they're prioritising their quality of life over the quality of life of people who can't even afford to live in the neighbourhood. And the YIMBYs are starting to gain the upper hand over the NIMBYs in public debate and in policy. Both in New South Wales and Victoria, the state governments have made fairly substantial changes to planning laws to allow more infill development, that is, demolishing existing houses, mostly standalone houses, and making way for townhouses, terraces and units to fit more people in. But it isn't clear that removing planning restrictions alone will result in the kind of massive supply increase that Peter Tulip was talking about.
Right, and why is that then?
Well, for one thing, the construction sector is absolutely struggling to keep up with current levels of demand. The post-pandemic shortage of materials and tradespeople saw the cost of building a new home rise by 30% over the 4 years to June 2024. Another part of the problem related to costs is that we've had a 12% decline in productivity in the construction sector over the past 3 decades. And then the other question is whether projects stack up financially even with less planning regulations, especially when interest rates are at relatively high levels. And developers are not a charity because it's a pretty risky business. And to be fair to them, it's a hard process. They have to pay high interest on land they've bought while they wait for approvals, and they want a return.
Right, so hang on. Does increasing the supply of dwellings actually make them cheaper then, in your view, or not?
Well, look, Sam, I think there's no doubt that a shortage of housing drives prices higher. But economics is all about the balance of supply and demand. So simply blaming a lack of supply ignores completely the other half of the equation. It assumes that the demand for housing is a given, which it isn't. Demand for property is nearly infinite. If real estate was, cheap enough, if I could afford it, I might want to own 3 different houses or 6 or a dozen.
Why not?
Let's face it, a lot of rich people do.
Yeah.
They own a dozen houses around the world. But the reality is land isn't infinite. Construction resources aren't infinite, and not everyone can own a dozen homes without other people missing out.
All right, Michael, let's shift the tone a bit because we're ready for some hope. After everything we've discussed, there is a glimmer of hope, right?
Yes, so Sam, I want to take you on a journey. I want you to imagine a place where house prices had increased by less than incomes, at least over the last 5 years. A place where unit prices hadn't increased at all over that time. So that means both houses and units have actually become cheaper in real terms.
You can get ice creams here, right?
You can afford your ice cream and still have a house.
Great.
Now, I'm not talking about one of those outback mining towns here. I'm talking about a major city, in fact, one of Australia's truly global cities. I'm talking about Melbourne.
So how much does a house cost in Melbourne now then?
So a typical median-priced house costs nearly $917,000, according to the latest figures from CoreLogic.
Yep, that's a lot.
It's a lot. A middle-priced unit is a lot cheaper, though. It costs just over $600,000. But given that there are a lot of units in townhouses in Melbourne, the median home price is just over $770,000, and that's lower than 5 other capital cities.
It's still a lot of money, but it's getting cheaper in Melbourne. So why is that? What is actually happening there?
So it's partly deliberate and partly by accident. We've just been talking about supply. Melbourne has added about 30% more new homes per person than Sydney has over recent years. And that's partly due to Melbourne's more favourable geography. You can have urban sprawl more easily in Melbourne. But it's also due to some large infill developments, especially high-rise apartments near the CBD.
Right, so that is an example of how more supply works to lower prices.
It is, but there is more to the story because the Victorian government, first under Dan Andrews and then under Jacinta Allen, has also deliberately brought in a range of policies to reduce demand. So it's brought in a vacant property tax, a new short-term accommodation levy to discourage Airbnb and similar kinds of accommodation, and an increase in land taxes for investors. Now, as a result of all that, investor lending has dropped, And the number of rental bonds fell by 22,000 last financial year, which shows you that investors are actively selling out of the market. But as we discussed earlier, guess what? Those homes didn't disappear. Who bought them? Other Bureau of Statistics figures show that first home buyers made up more than 40% of the people seeking home loans, and that's the highest anywhere in Australia except for the ACT. The other factor at play, though, is probably one the Victorian government won't want to claim credit for, and that's because the state economy is weaker than pretty much anywhere else in the country.
So why don't we just roll out some of these ideas that they've put in place in Victoria across the country?
Well, that's a very good question, Sam, and it basically comes down to the politics of annoying housing investors. The Victorian government has copped a lot of stick for running what some media outlets describe as a basket case economy and a basket case housing market. But the question is, basket case for whom?
That's right.
Now, if you look at some of the policies, they could have a national application. There are estimates from the Bureau of Statistics that up to 140,000 homes are sitting vacant. Some of those homes have been empty for decades and they're falling apart, and they could be sold and fixed up and lived in.
What a shame.
Now, obviously, putting a tax on them would encourage people who own those and are sitting on them, watching the land value going up, to actually sell them to someone who wants to use them. You can also see how taxes or limits on short-term accommodation can push some of those back into the long-term rental market, keeping rents down, and maybe even force some investors to put them up for sale. And then there's the big one that only the ACT has tackled so far. The ACT is on a 20-year process of replacing stamp duty with land tax. And it is the one tax reform in housing that virtually every economist agrees on, from Peter Tulip to Rachel Ongviforge. And the reason is simple. Stamp duty is a transaction tax and it locks people into where they live. So all those empty nester couples with a 5-bedroom house on 800 square metres, they have a disincentive to sell and move somewhere smaller because they'd have to pay stamp duty on the new home.
Yeah, an extra cost.
But if you had a land tax instead,
Yes.
they'd actually have an incentive to sell because they'd be paying tax on that 800 square metres of land that they don't really use.
Right, yes.
And so they'd probably want to move to an apartment because it would be cheaper. Aside from that, one of the problems of stamp duties for first home buyers is the deposit barrier. It's an upfront cost. You have to borrow the money to pay stamp duty.
And it can be a lot.
It can be $50,000, $80,000, over $100,000, depending what kind of home you're buying. And the problem with having to borrow that money, not only does it take you longer to save up your deposit, but you end up paying interest on that bigger loan. So in the long term, we'd actually all be better off, except for the big banks, who'd have smaller loans and less interest earnings.
So, Michael, we've been on quite a journey through Australia's housing crisis, which has been, we know, decades in the making. And now we really are at crunch time and at the end of this series. So, what are your key takeaways from everything that we have discussed over this past week?
Sam, let's go right back to the beginning. Do you remember Margaret Lomas, the property investor?
Our number is definitely over 25. At one point it was over 40. We've really massaged that portfolio now, gotten rid of a couple of the lemons, finally gotten rid of cans.
So she and her husband built up that portfolio from scratch. I spoke with her. She's very intelligent. She worked hard, there's no doubt about that, and she played by the rules. So if you listen to that story and you got angry about the size of her property portfolio, I would say don't take it out on Margaret, blame the rules of the game. Because she played by those rules. And I think also if the only rules that we end up changing are the planning ones, then there's a very good chance we'll build a lot more new homes that end up being owned by property investors. If the aim is to maintain and increase home ownership rates, if that's still the great Australian dream, to own your own home, and for most people to be able to do that, then I don't think we can stop at the supply side.
So what more should be done in your view?
The capital gains tax discount and negative gearing together give encouragement to investors as well as a financial boost. So we could go back and look at some of the changes to limit those tax breaks, like the changes that Bill Shorten and his Labor opposition took to the 2019 election.
Is it right that we spend billions of dollars to give people the ability to claim a subsidy when they invest in a property in the future? Or should we properly fund our hospitals and schools? It's not a zero-sum game. And I also want one day for some of the kids of some of the property investors to be able to get into the housing market too.
But that was a policy that was a big part of the reason why Bill Shorten lost that election. Let's face it.
Yeah, it certainly was, Sam, and that's exactly the problem with so many of these demand-side changes that could be effective in keeping a lid on home prices. They create losers, and that's even if they leave most Australians better off.
Yeah, and it's difficult, isn't it? Because the majority of Australians, they either own homes outright or they have mortgages at this point. So the thought of their property prices falling doesn't sit that well. Not everyone is going to sit up and cheer for property prices to go down.
I think the counter to that is we're now seeing some of those people who own their own homes now have their adult kids living with them for years, into their 30s, trying to save up to break into the property market, or just living at home because they can't afford the rent anymore. I do think that is focusing the mind of many people who own their own homes to say, actually, even though it would cost us on paper, we do want housing to be more affordable for our kids and for their kids.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we're heading for a federal election, of course. Can we expect to see much policy around this issue? We know politicians are talking about it all the time. It's a hot button issue. But can we actually expect anything concrete from any of these parties?
Probably not from the major parties, Sam. We've seen subsidies announced from both the government and the opposition to help developers build more new housing, so more supply-side policies. We've seen the Albanese government already announce changes to the lending rules so that banks don't have to count your HECS debts when they assess how much you can borrow. And the Dutton opposition's come up with a plan to allow people to access some of their super for a housing deposit. But both of these policies are demand side. They just let people borrow more and pay more for housing. And in the end, that's only going to push house prices higher, especially if we don't address the supply side.
This is my final question to you for this series, and I want the truth from you about this. Are any of those hard, bold decisions ever really going to be made? Is anything ever really going to change?
In the end, Sam, that's up to us. Nothing will change if no one pushes for change. And there are people pushing for change. You look at the Yimby movement. They're trying to get more development because they think that will help them afford a house in the places they want to live in our big cities. Is it enough by itself? Probably not. We've made ourselves housing hostages because we've allowed vested interests to dictate housing policy for 30 years or more. And it's going to take more than a few years and a couple of elections to unwind those policies. But Victoria shows it's possible if you have some political will to make changes, if you have the political position to make changes with a very dominant government that hasn't felt under threat, then you can do quite sweeping reforms that could lower housing prices. But to do it on a national basis, you actually need people to push their politicians. As we heard, politicians are property owners. Most of them are property investors in our federal parliament. They're not going to make changes that cost themselves money unless they have to keep their jobs. And so until people who've been locked out of the housing market, until the housing hostages themselves rise up and demand change, nothing is going to happen. And we have to start the change pretty soon because it's going to take a long time to fix.
That's the ABC's business editor, Michael Janda. All 5 episodes of our Housing Hostages series are available on the ABC Listen app. Please tell your friends about it and follow ABC News Daily so you don't miss an episode. Our series producer is Cara Jensen-McKinnon. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody, with additional production by Sydney Peed and Adair Shepherd. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. To get in touch with the team, please email us on abcnewsdaily@abc.net.au. I'll be back next week with regular episodes of ABC News Daily, stepping through one big news story shaping your world each weekday morning in less than 15 minutes. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Jan Fran, and if you're listening to ABC News Daily, I have a feeling you're going to enjoy listening to our new podcast too. It's called Conspiracy: War on the Waterfront, and it'll take you behind one of the biggest industrial showdowns in Australia's history. We're talking about that day in April 1998, when security guards wearing balaclavas and wielding Alsatians kicked 1,400 workers from their jobs on the docks. What led up to that moment? Almost has to be heard to be believed. So make sure you listen to Conspiracy: War on the Waterfront. To find it, search for Rewind on the ABC Listen app.